Hi everybody. I'd just like to welcome you all along to my very first video. I figured seeing as the classes are cancelled at the moment and everybody's in their, well, most people are in their houses in a bit of self-isolation, there's no reason why we can't do painting, okay? It's quite a solitary activity. It's something you can do in the comfort of your own home. And I thought, most people are probably fairly well able to get on with a little bit of painting. I might just need a little bit of guidance. So I'm going to go through what I was going to do in the workshops this weekend on a video. I had thought about doing video conferencing, but I think the technology might be a little bit tricky for some people. With a video, this is really easy. I'll have sent you the link. I'll have sent you photos as well on the same email. And you can just watch the video. You can pause it whenever you want. Take your time going through this painting. So I was going to do 3 small pochads or oil sketches. One of them I'm going to do right now is going to be monochrome, so kind of greys. The next one I'll do will be sort of full of hot colours, yellows and oranges and things. And then the third one I'll do will be a nocturne, which will be more sort of along the lines of the blues and mauves. So, right, let's get started. The first thing you want to do is just have your gear together, first of all, okay? So, I have a canvas panel, a blank one. 6x8 is great for doing a nice, quick, small painting like this. I've got some towels. I've got an acrylic paint to put the ground on with, okay? This is just to take the white off the surface of the canvas. Personally, I find white very difficult to deal with. If we can just take the edge off it slightly, like this, it's much more forgiving to paint with. Make sure it's an acrylic, okay? Because this dries quickly and then the oil can be put on as a subsequent layer. A lot of people would use an oil paint for this layer and then wipe out. That's absolutely fine. It's not too different a process from what we're going to do, but an acrylic, okay? So probably best to prep it first of all, and then I'll go through the rest of the gear, because at least this can be drying while I'm doing it. So what I do is put a blob of paint on, not too much, and then a good idea to put this paint away so we don't mistake it for oil paint later on. I take a baby wipe, which is great because it's got water in it. Water mixes with acrylic paint perfectly. It's a water-based medium. So I'm going to spread the paint around first of all. And that's a perfect base. Not too light, not too dark. You can create some fantastic effects with really dark grounds, but it can be very tricky to paint with as well. So we keep it just at the stage of tinting the canvas, okay? So let's look at the rest of the gear. I have a sketchbook here. I have some Notan pens, so I have a black and a grey. You don't have to do this stage, okay? But I'm going to illustrate it. So even if you just watch while I do that, I think it'll help you out. I have some medium, which is half and half, odour-free solvents and linseed oil. I have the majority of my painting, because it's monochrome, the majority of it is going to be done with greys. Now I make my greys with burnt umber, okay, and ultramarine. So I'm going to put out roughly equal quantities of each, around about that much. You don't want to be too stingy with paint, because it means you're too stingy in your painting. And if you put too much paint out, you tend to end up with an unmanageable palette and too much paint on the canvas itself. Then obviously we need some white as well. So I'm using a Griffin Alkyd white, which helps everything dry because it has a synthetic dryer in it, okay? So after about 2 or 3 hours, that paint starts to thicken up. You can create some really nice effects with it at that stage. So let's look at the image I sent out to you. So you'll all have got this. So it's somewhere in Ireland. It's just an image taken off the internet. It's great for this sort of monochrome painting because it's predominantly greys. There's a very small amount of green and a very small amount of red in it there, okay? So what I've done with this image, you'll see on the email, is I've first of all turned it into black and white. So we just want to eliminate the colour aspect of it at the start, okay, just for now. I've then increased the contrast slightly, just to add a bit more drama. And then I've gone on to do what I call the notan, okay? Now this is a really important stage. This is about finding the pattern of light and dark. And that's really what the entire painting hinges on. All the sort of fancy decorative brushwork in the world won't make up for a bad notan. So I'm going to do the little sketch first of all. I'm going to go back to the photo. You can print out the photos if you want so that you can look at the video on your computer screen and paint along, and then you'll have, just by your side, you'll have the image printed out as well. Or if you have a phone and an iPad, you can have two screens on at the same time. So here's my blank page. And the great thing about doing a notan with markers is it encourages you to eliminate detail and to work with masses, especially a marker with a good fat edge like that, okay? So what I'm going to do first of all, I just want to make it really small, again, to discourage me from going into too many details. So let's just make a little square there. I'm going to draw it out roughly. So as I'm exploring this notan, I'm looking at the structure of what's going on. So I'm not going in painting blind. I'll have information about the shape of objects or elements. I'll also have information about where the lights and the darks lie. So what we have is this line rising of vegetation. And I always try and do curves out of straight sections of line. It just makes them a lot more dynamic. I have this large massive mountain falling down. Again, I'm not trying to do curves. And then it rises again, not quite as steeply on the following side. I then have this beautiful path working its way through. So it changes direction a few times. So look at it this way. It comes out here, first of all, and that's the left-hand side. The right-hand side then won't be the exact same angle. It widens as it comes forward. Then it does the same. It kicks angle like that, but then on the right-hand side, it kicks out more. Do you see the way it's converging out like that? And then the next turn of angle, it comes forward and it comes much wider. So that's perspective at work, and you can see it really sort of advancing towards you. So they're the main shapes in the image. Now I'm going to block in some of the lights and the darks. So if you go to the notan, you'll be able to see what's going on there. So we have greys, we have all of this path appears predominantly grey. You might just pick out, sometimes in photos, things aren't very obvious, but you might just pick out on the photo a lovely little bit of the path or the road in the distance. Okay, so it gives it a lot of extra depth. It's like the road's coming along and then it jumps up a hill and starts coming towards us. So I'm going to block in this grey, and you can see with the notan you can't get too detailed because you've just got a very chunky marker to work with. Okay, are there any more greys? Yes, there are. There are greys coming into the foreground. Now there's a tiny little glimpse of white there, but most of this path is in grayscale. Okay, we can also create direction with the notan markers, and then in for this mass of really dark vegetation. Great time for my marker to run out. And then I have the posts sticking up, really bouncing along, aren't they? Starting larger in the foreground and getting smaller as they recede. Okay, and there I have a very crude sort of black and white or a grayscale map of the values that I need to paint. Right, in the meantime, my canvas should have dried. The acrylic, is dry. So I'm ready to go on that. I'm just going to anchor it in there. Pull it up perpendicular so you can see what's going on. Right. So the first thing I do is I'm going to just put a light layer of medium across the canvas. This helps me on my painting. It helps the paint to flow around and create a nice effect. What oil paint does well is it sort of flows, it blends into itself quite easily. So we want to give that a little helping hand. So just a very, very small amount of medium. And what it does is it stops me having to use medium in the, or so much medium in the painting, which, as you probably have found out, can be quite a difficult thing to deal with when there's too much medium. All the paint starts sort of flopping around the place. So I've just given it a nice light layer. Okay, if you tilt it to the side, you should be able to see in the light when you've just got a nice light covering on that. So I've got my cloth there. The only other materials I have are, I've got my brush and I've got a palette knife here. I might use this later on. So I'm using a fairly big brush, a number 6, which might seem gigantic for such a small painting. But again, a big brush really encourages us to loosen up, okay? And we want this to be a nice, loose sketch with a bit of atmosphere in it, not too hard-edged and graphic. So I'm going to take a blob of blue and a blob of brown, roughly equal quantities of each, and mix them together. Notice that I'm being very careful that I don't spread that paint out too much, okay? Making sure that it's not tinted too far towards the blue or the brown. Keeping the paint on the tip of the brush, and I've got a nice pool of paint there I can work with, okay? Just squeezing some out, taking the excess off with the brush, not squeezing too hard, just taking the excess off. And now I can start the drawing by picking up a little bit of paint and using the tip of the brush to do exactly the same thing as I did with the Notan. It's just a guideline. Think of it as scaffolding for your painting, okay? You remember this part where the lines become wider as they advance? Okay. So that's the bare bones of the drawing. And now I'm going to try and block it in a little bit. So there's one thing I need to be careful of on this, and that's with the darks. I have, if you look at the image, I've got a mass of darks here and here, but I also have these individual poles sticking up. So I may need to do the darks in 2 stages. Just block in the mass, then later on create some appropriate consistency of paint that would be able to lay on top, okay? So I've got my darkest value, that's fine. I need a middle value for the mountains, and I need a lighter value for the sky. So I'll take some of this paint, add a little bit of white to it. I'm going to test the values, okay? So that's my lightest. Not my lightest, my middle value, sorry. This is my darkest. And then my lightest is going to be white again. You notice when I go from one value to the other, I just wipe the excess off the brush, okay? So that's my lightest. I can always pull it up a little bit. Now you can see that the light value is okay. The dark value is okay. That middle value there, it's too dark. It needs to come up. It's closer to the white of the sky than it is to the black of the foreground. So that needs to come up a good bit. So I've got white on the brush. I can bring it into that grey, lightening it. Let's try it now. That's a bit more like it. Okay. So for this one, I might block in, first of all, that middle value. So a successful painting, especially a landscape, is one that's made up of hard and soft edges. Hard edges give you definition so that you know what you're looking at, like the edge of the mountain and the poles. And soft edges give you atmosphere. Okay? So I'm going to cut in the edge, turn in the brush as and when I need it, and then work the paint out. Rather than sort of timidly working your way up to the edge, I know they're scary, dive straight in, tackle the edge, and then work your way out. Now the paint's fairly thin on that. I'll mix up some more later on, but that's okay. Have I got any more of that grey anywhere? Yes, I do. I have it down here, don't I? In the path. So quite a bit of that path is the same grey. So I actually need to mix up a little bit more paint. So I'm going to be careful that it goes to the same value. If it's going too brown, I pull it back with a little bit of blue and vice versa. Bit too dark. It's easier to mix up plenty of paint at the start rather than backtracking. Let's try that. That's okay, a little bit more like it. So now into this foreground. I've got a definite shape, but it has very soft edges, doesn't it? This had very hard edges, but this doesn't. So I'm sort of looking for where I might be able to put an edge on that and then softening it. Okay? And if you look carefully at the photo, you'll see actually the end of that path disappears into the mountain. Okay, we have a lost edge there. I'm going to do the same over here. Set in the edge or the shape and then soften them. Soften the edges, okay? Now, let's go in maybe with a dark value, okay? So I want to keep this fairly thin paint, all right? So, side of the brush, nice sketchy effect. Now, my board is absorbing quite a bit of this paint, so I'm going to dilute it down a little bit, just a tiny bit, and you'll see it flows much better now, okay? Now, we need to be careful with this stuff, okay? Not too much, because wet paint gives you hard edges. So block in the mass and then soften the edges. And in this instance, they pretty much disappear into the path, the lighter grey of the path. Same over here. And same for that central section. Just being careful to follow the rules that we saw earlier, where it starts thin and then widens out. So starting thin, getting wider, changing direction, getting wider still. Next stage is to block in the sky. Again, I may need to just dilute my paint ever so slightly. Come in for a hard edge. Hard edge, and then fill in the rest. Okay, and there we have the blocking done. Very rough, very crude, but we have the darks in the right place and the lights in the right place. Just one thing left, which is to put in the posts. So big in the foreground, one mark, getting smaller as they recede, and turning the brush so that paint sits on top of the underlayer. One mark for each post. What happens when the paint starts to pick up the underlayer? You haven't got enough paint on the brush. We need to put some more on. As they recede, it doesn't matter if they pick up a little bit of the underlayer, because if you look carefully, you'll see actually they fade into the background, don't they? So it makes sense to use our good dense paint here, and as we go back and it's picking up the underlayer, it gets lighter and lighter and fades into the background. Right, my next stage, I'm going to beef that up a little bit, but I'm going to go to the color image, and I'm going to add a little bit of color into this. So we have greens. I'm going to use a permanent sap green. There's various brands available. They're all a little bit different. This one's quite dark, okay, and it's also very neutral, which means it doesn't tend towards blue or towards yellow. If you look carefully, you'll see on the right hand side in the photo, you'll see a little bit of red in the leaves over there. So I'm going to bring in a dark alizarin claret, this is, but a crimson would work just as well. Now the great thing about those two is if we mix them together, we get brown. So, whoops, excuse me. So I'm going to go over this again with those three values, and I'm going to tint them where necessary. So let's start with the darkest value for this one. I need to create a sort of brown colour. Now I know green and red together are going to make a brown. Let's give it a go. Yeah, perfect. And it might not look like anything, but it's just it's integrating these two colours into the entire painting. So, as we said earlier, the darkest part, if you look at the photo, is in the foreground. As this recedes, it picks up some of the underlayer, and these masses get lighter and lighter as they go back. So that helps with our sense of aerial perspective, it's called. The same over here. So as I'm working this brush, I'm thinking about edges as well. So I can flick some marks with the brush to mimic the grasses. Okay, and as they recede, they pick up the underlayer and they start to fade out. Now, a really tricky one is this green in the foreground. When we look at the colour photo, can you see how vibrant that green has become? And yet when we looked at the Notan, it was a really dark grey. In fact, it was almost black. This is the deceptive quality of paint. So I'm going to go somewhere in between. I'm not going to go as dark as black, but I'm not going to go as light as I think it is. So I need to take some green. Let's add a little bit of white to that green so I can see what's going on. Your sap green may not be as dark as this one, okay? Let's pop a little bit on. Okay, so that's sort of working. You can see it's just adding in a little tint of colour without overpowering it or without taking over from that very solid sort of structure of masses and values. Now, a little bit of colour theory and perspective theory. If you look at the colour photograph, you'll notice how of this green section, the bit in the foreground appears more vibrant. It's actually warmer. It has yellow in it. And as these bits of grass recede, the yellow disappears out of them. It's called aerial perspective. So more yellow in the foreground. As it goes back, it disappears into the grey tint, okay? Now, the yellow I'm going to use is a yellow ochre, nice soft yellow. Excuse me while I find my yellow ochre. Here we are. So what I've done here is I've taken a little bit of the green and I just want to tint it. I don't want to add too much. So I've got green here in the central section. I've got the same green over here and then fade it out. It's all about soft edges, this stuff. Okay, green there as well. As it goes back, it fades into the background. As it recedes, it's picking up a bit of warmth. So a little bit of yellow ochre into that. Now you can see the effect once I put it on. It just advances right forward, doesn't it? So I'm using a lot of hatching lines. I'm not wall painting, okay? Hatching to create interesting marks. Okay. There we go. Right, into this grey. So as I'm lifting, I'm working in layers, okay, all the time. So very thin layer, and then I'm starting with a slightly thicker layer now, and then I'm going to be getting thicker and thicker, okay? So I just want to put a little more paint into this grey here. I think it needs to be a little darker. So I'm looking at what's there and I'm looking at the photo. I think it needs to be a little bit darker. Okay. Just covering up the canvas, taking the edge off some of that. Hatching marks on can work very well, okay? So it creates that sort of mottled effect rather than something really dense and hard-edged. Just make sure you're not smearing paint around for no reason. As we come up into the distance, a little more paint on there and working on these edges as well, and then up into the distance it disappears into the mountain. I want to get more paint onto these, so I'm basically just going with the same value but thickening up the paint a little bit. I might tint it slightly towards the blue. Have a look at that, yeah. Okay, what I'm doing here is breaking up the masses with a bit of negative space. So can you see this effect now? Because we've got a fairly strong division there between the dark and the light. I can break it up by suggesting a little pocket of light coming through. It's a very neat little trick in landscape painting. Okay. And now up more paint into that grey of the sky. Okay. So plenty of paint on the brush, turning the brush and cutting in an edge against that mountain and then filling in the rest. Now there's one other lovely little glint of that sky coming in here on the path. And the reason for that is it's water on the path that's reflecting the sky, so it's pretty much the same colour and the same value. So this is even thicker paint. So we were thin at the start, then a little thicker. Now we're putting on what's called impasto. So we scoop up paint and lay it on gently. Okay. Now, the next stage is where I'm going to start breaking apart all these masses, okay? Looking at very subtle variations between them. So I might start with this one. It doesn't really matter which I start with. I'm going to go for these mountains on either side. So I'm looking for areas that are slightly lighter, slightly darker. So I'm picking up some of the sky paint, and I can see I've got some very light, subtle little accents of light on the top there. Very, very subtle. You have to look very carefully to see them. Okay. And there's a few more coming down here. And then we have that light of the path coming along here. Okay. Where else do I have light? I have a little bit of light in here. And I can see some more of it coming up here. Because these are so subtle, I'm leaving them till near the end of the painting. Maybe I'll go into the sky now. So picking up more paint. Okay. And adding some thicker impasto. There's two reasons for this. I'm lightening the sky a little bit. I'm also adding creative brushwork into the painting. Now, where else do I see that? Well, I've done my light here. What do I have? I have a very subtle, this is really sort of end stage of the painting. There's some very subtle little glimpses of light coming along these stones in the foreground. These are the things that make your painting look much more complex than it really is. All illusion. Okay. Maybe at this stage I could go into the grasses and see if there's some more variation within them. Maybe just some very subtle little flecks of light, looking at the negative space again, where we can see glimpses of the green through the darker foliage here. Now, one thing to be careful of is if I've got the paint that goes into these little pockets of light has to be the same as the paint here, here and here. Paint that goes into the pockets of light there matches this paint, and so on and so forth. Now I'm going to go into this mass of really dark foliage here. What I have is I have a slightly subtler bit of foliage here, so it's a little bit lighter. So if I'm trying to create a middle value, there's nothing wrong with adding a little bit of lighter paint onto the darker paint. Okay, what we don't want to do is keep going or put it in an inappropriate place and then it becomes mud. Okay. So I've got some of those reds, haven't I, over here? So you can see some dark reds. And what are they but maybe little bits of leaves catching the light. So I could add a little bit of yellow ochre into it to lighten it, into the orange. Let's see how that works. Yeah, so it's just catching the eye there. Not too much of it. And everything as it recedes, it's losing its intensity. So if we had a sort of reddish orange leaf here, as it goes back, it loses intensity, which is why it makes sense to start at the front as your brush goes back and it picks up the underlayer or picks up contaminated paint, it gets lighter. We've got the same here. As it goes back, the colours running out of my brush and it creates lighter, more subtle aspects. Let's add a little bit more white to that because we've got a few accents which are quite light in the foreground here. A bit of pure red in the background there would not work at all. Okay, it'd be way too strong. Now I'm going to come in with the really dark accents for those poles. So I'm going to go back to blue and brown. I need to do something to this paint for it to sit on top of the underlayer. So I'm actually going to dilute it down a little bit. So I've got a fairly fluid paint. I'm going to pull these up nice and strong. As I go back, they pick up the underlayer of paint and they get lighter, and I get the effect of the aerial perspective. Do the same over here. I'm turning the brush as well. I've got some lovely, very thin lines of grass coming up. Now, if I'm good with the brush, very careful, I should be able to just pull them up. If you struggle a bit, or if your brush isn't great quality, a palette knife is great for this. So I just simply put the paint on the edge of that blade and then pull the blade across. Okay, I think I'm fairly finished with that. Let's just take one step back. Often the light accents are the ones that really catch your eye, so there may be a case for just pulling in that little glint of light there, one or two really strong marks of white, and then I think I'm pretty much finished. Okay, thanks for watching. I hope your paintings went well. I'll send through another link tomorrow or the day after to a video for the second painting. Okay, happy painting. Thank you.